Namaskar. Good evening, Tashidelek, to all our friends, our audience. Today we are going to discuss a very interesting subject, which is to do with China and Tibet. Our subject today will be human rights situation inside Tibet, and we have three experts with us. So, to start with, I will give you a very short introduction of the organizers and our experts, and then we'll start with our experts. This webinar is jointly organized by two groups. One is the Center for Himalayan Asia Studies and Engagement, which is a think tank and focused on understanding issues which are impacting countries and societies in and around Himalayan Asia region. And it's a platform for exchange of knowledge, views, and perspectives among Indian and international experts, researchers, writers, and advocacy groups who take keen interest on various aspects of political, social, economic, and strategic developments in this region. And our co-organizer is Tibetan Youth Congress, which is the largest and the oldest socio-political organization of Tibetan diaspora. Currently, it is the third generation of Tibetan youths, the refugees, who are born in exile in India and are leading TYC. And as everybody knows, Tibetan Youth Congress has proven to be a very successful nursery of Tibetan leadership in exile. And the members of TYC in the past have risen to the highest places, including the prime ministers and the president of CTA, the ministers, members of parliament, and some of the best statesmen, academicians, and scholars uh, of Tibet have gone through Tibetan Youth Congress. So we have three speakers today. We have Mr. Jaidev Ranade, who is president of Center for China Analysis and Strategy in New Delhi, who is a seasoned China analyst. Welcome, Mr. Jaidev Ranade. He has been the formal additional secretary in the cabinet secretariat of Government of India, and he has had been posted at very important places which include Hong Kong, Beijing, Washington, and he's a person who has very deep knowledge of security and intelligence related issues. Uh, he has been a China analyst for more than 25 years. We know him for his very sharp analysis on developments inside China. He is one of those experts who are very familiar with the Chinese language and the situation inside China, how China works, how the Communist Party of China works, and how its external relations system functions, its intelligence system, and all those issues. And he has been with the Jawaharlal Nehru University for 2 years. So welcome, Mr. Jaidev Ranade.
Thank you.
Our second speaker is Mr. Tenzin Chundu, who is a very famous name and face for everyone who knows, understands Tibet. He is a very famous poet, writer, and activist uh, of the Tibetan community, and he is among the best known faces of Tibetan freedom movement. He was born to a Tibetan refugee couple in one of those road construction camps in the northern India in Himalayas. Chindu has four books to his credit. He is the winner of Outlook Picador Award, the first winner, and his writings are now anthologized and taught in many Indian colleges and universities. And his work has been translated into many languages. The last count I remember was 15 languages. So he is a very famous personality of the Tibetan diaspora. Welcome, Tenzin Sudhu, to this discussion. And we have,
Definitely.
surely not least, the third speaker is Meenakshi Ganguly, who is a very well-known face to everyone who is who has interest in human rights, especially in Asia. So she is the South Asia director at Human Rights Watch. She is stationed at Mumbai, and she oversees the organization's work in South Asia. She has been active with the Human Rights Watch since 2004, and she has been a very keen observer of human rights related issues in India, in Nepal, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, uh, the entire South Asia region. And before she took to activism with the Human Rights Watch, she was a very active, prolific journalist working with the Time magazine. And she was the correspondent, South Asia correspondent of Time magazine. And she has covered extensively India, Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Afghanistan. So she understands this area like back of her hand. And more than everything, she is a very keen China watcher. She is the eye of Human Rights Watch in South Asia for China also. So we will have the benefit of her perspective on China and the situation inside the occupied Tibet and other colonies. So welcome Meenakshi Ganguly to this discussion. And of course, we have our co host, Mr. Gumpo Dondup, who is the president of Tibetan Youth Congress. Uh, he will be presenting his uh, concluding comments on this discussion along with his vote of thanks. And now, before I start, I'll try to give a very short background to our those audience members who are not very much familiar with Tibet. So I'm taking the risk of repetition, but I will try to be as short as possible. As we all know, China occupied Tibet in 1950, and in the first 9-10 years, China has been trying to win the hearts of Tibetans by giving so many promises which were never kept. So there was uprising against Chinese rule in 1959, which led to a huge violence, resulting violence by the People's Liberation Army, which resulted, if we go by United Nations records, more than 80,000 killings in first fortnight. So after that, it has been a very serious case of denial of human rights in Tibet from 1959 to 1989. Mao Zedong and his colleagues have been thinking that if you knock out religion from a Tibetan's heart and mind, you will get a very patriotic Chinese citizen. And that's why they did their best to destroy Tibetan culture and every symbol of Tibetan religion, Tibetan language, and Tibetan social system. But still, they found in 1987, 1989, the widespread demonstrations in Tibet against China opened the eyes of Chinese rulers, and they realized that it was impossible to knock out religion or faith from the hearts of any race, and especially Tibetans. So, since then, they adopted a policy of occupying religion from within. And this process is going on. And I won't go into those details, but what we see after noticing that the Tibetans in Tibet, which means Tibetan means those uh, whose previous two generations had never seen Dalai Lama or a free Tibet, even those young people are in the forefront of resistance against Chinese colonial rule. And if you go and see the list of more than 160 self-immolations since 2009, you will find that most of them are below 35. They are young people. So that is why Xi Jinping has now adopted a policy of total cultural assimilation and dissolving the Tibetan identity into Chinese Han Chinese identity. So as a result, we are seeing so many phases of human rights denial, which includes the silicization of education policy, destruction of statues, ban on religion, all these things. But our friends, our experts will be talking of those subjects. So may I now request Mr. Uh, Ranade, Jaidev Ranade, to please present your presentation. Mr. Jaidev Ranade, please.
Thank you very much, Vijay Kranti ji, and warm greetings to all those who are here, my co-panelists as well as the listeners. Tashi Dileg and Namaskar. Uh, I think what we are discussing today is something broader than just human rights violations in Tibet. What we are beginning to see, or what we are seeing, is actually the effort to eliminate a civilization and a unique culture from the face of the earth. That is the attempt that is being made. And it started, as you rightly pointed out, quite some time ago, ever since the Chinese came to occupy Tibet. But let me just highlight a few instances to freshen the minds of our listeners and those who are interested. I would set the tone from actually the uh, reign or rule of the party secretary Chan Kwango, who after being party secretary of Tibet moved to Xinjiang. But in Tibet, he brought in new draconian measures with the objective of controlling the Tibetan people and expanding surveillance on the Tibetan people. So he instituted this so-called iron grid system, which is well known to people who are watching the situation in Tibet, which means essentially that you are never far from a police post. And he tried to give it the colloquial term of convenience stations. Uh, the explanation being that if you need anything, you can just go there and get it. But their actual purpose was to intervene in any incident within 5 minutes of its occurring, within a radius of 50 meters from the police station. So you can imagine the density of this iron grid network. And that was in course of time, but during Chen Kwango's time, uh, reinforced with the Skynet, which was blanket electronic surveillance of all mobile phones and other electronic devices. In other words, Tibet was blanketed with surveillance mechanism to cover all Tibetans. I'm not talking about the special the special ID cards given to Tibetans, etc. But these were, to a large extent, a mixture of obtrusive and unobtrusive measures that were brought in. Just on another side, uh, some Tibetans inside Tibet used to joke at that time, half in jest, that by doing this, Chan Kwango had actually expanded the employment opportunities for the younger Tibetans because they needed so many people to listen in to the conversations. I presume they also, uh, did whatever was necessary as they were listening in. Around that time, there were also reports that, and fairly reliable reports, that the People's Armed Police had set up a camp for Tibetans at Shigatse, which is the second most important and largest town in Tibet, as we all know, after Lhasa. Uh, Thankfully, we haven't heard of many more such camps, but this camp was apparently designed on the same lines as the ones in Xinjiang. But as Chan Kwango began implementing these measures, which became quite harsh, around that time, uh, we noticed a fairly unusual statement by a very senior ranking Chinese Communist Party cadre. And that was Chin Wei, a lady who was senior faculty in the Chinese Central Party School, which is actually the cradle for Communist Party cadres who are upward mobile, people who have been cleared for taking over as party secretary and moving up. And she came out with a lengthy article. Obviously, it had clearance from the highest levels, uh, which was published in Hong Kong. And that specifically addressed the point that Vijayji just mentioned about uh, they're wanting to control the entire system. And she said that China must at all costs avoid a situation of two Dalai Lamas like we have of two Panchen Lamas. I'm just quoting her. And she also said in that it will be a very difficult job because the younger Tibetans, while they are attracted by material comforts, the older Tibetans are looking to the afterlife. And obviously, what her implication was that as the young become older, religion will continue to be a draw for them. And while there was a lot of debate on this, she traveled abroad to try and sell this point of view. It was a sort of a cosmetic, soft packaging that was being attempted, but it didn't seem to have really sat well, or at least been enforced the way it should have. The communists, as we all know, particularly the Chinese communists, I can say, are not used to dealing with religion or with religious issues. In fact, they have a tough time deferring with dealing with a differing point of view. So for them, this was a very difficult thing. Punctuated with this, after his departure for Xinjiang, year for last, we saw Xi Jinping's visit. But just prior to that, the Tibet Party Secretary at that time, Wu Ying-che, who was a person as close to being a Tibetan as you could get a Han to be, who had spent most of his life there, he began working on Tibetans when they were still in school and trying to get them to change their mind. But when Xi Jinping visited Lhasa last time, Ningxia and Lhasa, uh, at that time, the policies got more strict. And we saw Wang Yang, the chairman of the Chinese People's Consultative Political Conference, going to Inner Mongolia, going to Xinjiang, and going to Tibet, and selling the idea of the Han language, Mandarin, or Putonghua, becoming the primary language in schools. Till then, the schools of the ethnic minorities, as the Chinese call them, taught the minority language as the primary language till a certain point, and then um, Mandarin came in or Putonghua came in. But now the effort was to change them, including in the minority schools and including in the minority schools within the autonomous regions and autonomous prefectures. So the idea being to absolutely eliminate any chance of the local minority, Tibetan or Uyghur, learning his own history and culture. And I say this with a lot of responsibility because if we look at the Mongols, that is precisely what happened. They have altered the history and presented them new books, including new encyclopedias, which in fact remove uh, old Mongol, uh, kings and their legends from there. Tibet also has been given now a new encyclopedia, a new history. It's yet early to see what kind of impact that has. But in schools in Tibet, they have now started teaching these. They have started giving preference to Putonghua over Tibetan. And this is a very long range effort at trying to change the minds of the Tibetan people. Uh, it obviously hasn't succeeded. All these efforts over the years obviously hasn't succeeded because we have seen over the last 1.5 years, particularly, an intensified campaign against what they call the double faced cadres. Cadres who are working for the Chinese Communist Party or the Chinese authorities or the Tibetan Autonomous Region authorities, but who owe loyalty to the Dalai Lama. And there are repeated campaigns which have been stepped up. This time they've gone further. They've also asked for a political loyalty test of government servants in case they are to be retained in service or up for promotion. The same thing has now been introduced for Tibetan children who are clearing examinations and going to middle school or higher school, where in any case the uh, eligibility requirements are quite tough. So for jobs and for admission to higher schools, there is now a political test which comes in, which is fairly intensive, because this political test is not only by the school authorities, but the village cadre from where the child comes or the city cadre also provides his input to the authorities as to the political reliability and loyalty of the individual. Um, Whether others have understood this or not is a question. We have a number of Tibet support groups worldwide which are endorsing the Tibetan cause, which are trying to support the Tibetan cause, particularly the Dalai Lama's efforts. Uh, but we also had, I would call it, a disastrous visit, from my point of view at least, by Michelle Bachelet, the commissioner for the UN Human Rights Commission recently. She went there repeating Congresswoman Nancy Pelosi's visit of many years ago, and did not take a single foreign journalist with her during the visit at Chinese request. So what we saw was, whatever may have been her impressions, whatever may have been her own thoughts, and whatever report she may or may not produce, the Chinese were able to monitor the visit with their own people, and for their own population, which is important to them, send out the message put out by their journalists, by their well-trained party apparatchiks. So that visit, I think, was a classic case of not understanding how the Chinese spin a narrative, how the Chinese manage visits and manipulate these foreigners. What the rush was for her to go after having waited so many years is something I wouldn't know. Perhaps one of my panelists would be able to answer that better. Let me conclude by just highlighting one aspect, which is that we are today at a juncture which is particularly sensitive in the history of Tibet, and for that matter, in the history of China. India will be also drawn into it. This is, the Chinese have started preparing for some time now by trying to manipulate and pressurize the Tibetan Buddhist monks into following the selection procedure that the Chinese authorities have laid down, that the Chinese communists have laid down for the selection of monks. I'm not being facetious here, but these communists certainly have tried to enter into the religious realm. And there have been examples of certain sects or schools of thought, I won't go into detail and name them, who selected their leaders or their leading monks through the system that the Chinese are trying to institute. The Chinese have not entirely succeeded, but they are trying. As you all know, they have also tried to decide who is a genuine living Buddha and who is not, a genuine Tulku or not, by compiling a register. Now, if you try and access that register, you will find that it only comes one by one. You have to identify the particular Tulku you're looking for, which region and where you're from. So it makes it a very tedious and difficult job to try and get that. But it is at this time that the Chinese are mounting a lot of pressure on trying to see that they will be able to control the reincarnation as and when the time comes. The Dalai Lama has not made it easy for them. He has left the question hanging whether it's going to be a reincarnation, whether he's going to be a reincarnation or an emanation or something else. He's even opened up the prospect of not being reincarnated at all. But whatever it may be, the Chinese are very nervous about a reincarnation or an emanation being found or born outside their control, outside communist China. And the 14th Dalai Lama has made it clear that he will certainly not be reincarnated inside the bounds of an authoritarian or a dictatorial regime. So that rules China out. But they're trying very hard. And here I feel the Tibet Policy Support Act has come in at the right time. It has backed the backed a policy or made the US enunciate a policy which leaves the recognition of the reincarnation to the Tibetan people and said we will back that, and the Chinese should have uh, should not interfere in it. I think there were a couple of other overt indicators with the CTA Sichong, Mr. Pepper sitting traveling to Washington. From my understanding, it was a very good visit. He met the SCT, he met Kurt Campbell of the Indo-Pacific Affairs, and then uh, Ms. Zia, the special coordinator for Tibet, followed that up with a visit fairly quickly to Dharamsala. So I think the Chinese efforts are intense, they're intensifying, and the Tibetans are feeling the brunt, no doubt about it. But as was pointed out, self-immolations continue, protests continue. They're unwilling to acquiesce to Chinese domination. And I think in the time to come, it will become a more sensitive period that we will all enter. And that is where the Tibetan resolve will show, the Tibetan mettle will show, the standing of the CTA will come into play, and of course, the support by various other countries will come in. Let me just conclude by saying, as far as India's policy is concerned, from what I know, it is not to interfere, the government's policy is not to interfere in religious affairs, but they will go by the choice of the Tibetan people. I'll end there. Thank you very much, Vijay, for this opportunity. And I hand over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Ranade, for giving us a very close look at how the Chinese system functions, especially within Tibet, and the way you have explained how the surveillance system has come to a level where the Chinese police can reach any place or a trouble spot within 5 minutes, and police is present within 50 meters of distance. That I agree with you. In my travels through Tibet, I have seen this happening, and your look at uh, the Tibetans' efforts and on the issue of reincarnation, how China is nervous, that gives a very uh, a close view and a very encouraging view of you know what lies for future of Tibet. So thank you very much. So now may I request Mr. Tenzin Sundu, whom we know as one of the best known faces of Tibetan resistance and Tibetan intellectuals. Tenzin Sundula.
Namaste, Tashi Dilek. My name is Tenzin Sundu. I'm a Tibetan writer and activist based here in Dharamshala. Today, we are discussing human rights situation in Tibet. This, of course, is one of the many issues in Tibet. Of course, the main issue in Tibet today is 70 years of Chinese occupation, domination, subjugation of Tibet. And now, at a point today, we are where China is trying to appropriate Tibetan religion, culture, language to a point they want to homogenize Tibet into one of the Chinese backyards. And this is the serious case of genocide. It is not just human rights. But because today we are talking about human rights, I would like to speak about some of the issues on the ground, what is happening there, how China is violating human rights one point by points, and I would like to speak about these in little detail, and towards the end I'll make a overall conclusion. Like all occupying forces, China's main aim in Tibet today is mining. It's not Tibetan people, not religion, culture, population, it is mining. China is very focused on mining in Tibet. And mining in Tibet is important because Tibet overall is 2.5 million square kilometer of land. It's 25 lakh square kilometer of land, which is actually one fourth of China's 9.6 million square kilometer of land. One fourth of China's landmass is in Tibet, and there, if because China is subjugating, ruling over only 6 million population of Tibet, China is able to take huge advantage of mining in Tibet. And this mining is important for China because much of the Chinese production, especially where China needs lithium, copper, gold, and especially rare earth, China themselves, the companies, the media themselves have said that the best quality and largest amount of lithium, copper, gold, and especially rare earth are dug out of mostly eastern part of Tibet in Amdo and Kham region. So this is the main focus of China, and China has been facing the Tibetan resistance. Some of the Tibetans come right in front of the Chinese mining bulldozers, and they were willing to give their life, but trying to stop Chinese bulldozers from bombing mountains. And this is what they have been doing, bombing mountains, taking away natural resources in tons and millions of tons. And this is China's main interest. Now, mining requires huge parts of land, and how they are trying to do, especially when much of Tibet is nomadic pasture land. Much of the Tibetans, almost about 70-75%, have been nomads, and they require huge pasture lands for grazing in different seasons and their travel. So, in order to tackle with that, what they've been trying to do is they've been forcing or coercing or cajoling with Tibetans in trying to resettle. And this is what they've been doing for the past almost about 15, 20 years in resettling Tibetan nomads to artificial villages, uh, like the kind of reservations how the white Americans created for Native Americans. And today, Native Americans are towards the last end of their generation. This is exactly what China is doing in Tibet. Rehabilitation of Tibetan nomads and farmers into artificial villages where Tibetans are ending up becoming unskilled, unaware, complete stranger to urbanization, and they are becoming dishwashers in Chinese restaurants and cafes. And some of the women are in even being forced into prostitution. This is the serious situation. Almost about 1 million Tibetans have lost their land to mining, and they have now become dishwashers in Chinese restaurants. Um, One of the things was also in related to mining is labor force. One of the Tibet researcher is Adrian Zen, who has come out with reports where he said that there are many labor force camps all over Tibet. And these are traveling labor forces where you cannot pin down which labor force in which area. But these labor forces actually include both Tibetan as well as Chinese. And these are the people who work on making roads, railways, highways. And these facilities, these infrastructures are not for Tibetan people. This is to further facilitate mining and at a huge amount and very fast transport of mining ores from Tibet to China and the Chinese backyards. And this is how China is mining, getting all these mines for free. And this is how China is making cheap made in China products. I'll come to that point little later. Now, China sees that one of the resistance in Tibet is the future generation of the Tibetan people. China sees that in 70 years they have been trying to change the Tibetan people, subjugating them, forcing them, killing them, jailing them, punishing them. In whatever repercussions Tibetans have been facing, Tibetans never gave up. They've been resisting for 70 years. So China sees that this is that they cannot fight Tibetans physically. So now they see that the core unifying factor among the Tibetans is the Tibetan religion, culture, and language. And they look at these aspects as China's obstacle in conquering Tibet. And they've been miserably failing at it. So, therefore, now they have devised a new policy called bilingual education policy, where they are making Tibetans, they're telling them that, overall China is a big country where what is called the minorities must learn Chinese language. But what they actually do is they are replacing Tibetan textbooks by Chinese textbooks. They are making Tibetan language as secondary to Chinese language and making medium of instructions Chinese. And therefore, there is a threat that the future generation of Tibetans in the next 10, 15, 20 years, Tibetan youngsters may no longer speak Tibetan. Now, you see, in any language culture, in any civilization, it is the language that carries forward the culture. Culture is encapsulated and preserved in the form of live organic language. And this is why China is now targeting Tibetans. All Tibetan coaching classes, all Tibetan private schools, monastery run schools have been shut down, closed, and dispersed. Only Chinese government run schools are now being run. And in the recent times, Tibet Actions has come about with a very important and detailed reports on these boarding schools regiment, where they are forcibly making younger generation Tibetans from the age of 5, 6, and 7 to be admitted to these boarding schools, and they are given Chinese language education. So this is a very important appropriation of culture, and therefore trying to decimate Tibetan culture. This is a very serious attack on Tibetan culture. How this is going to come about, we will get to see in future. Tibetan religion, Buddhism, in the recent 1,003 to 400 years has actually become the main backbone of Tibetan civilization. And in this, we see that Buddhism is the one that has not only sustained the movement and has also given a hope to the Tibetan movement. Although Tibetans would find 100 reasons to give up, but they would find 101 more reason to fight and maintain this movement. And therefore, in 70 years, instead of changing Tibetan people quietly believe that their religion and culture, their Buddhism, may be a source of inspiration for the Chinese people, because China killed their own Buddha during the Cultural Revolution. Freedom of religion, culture, freedom of speech is completely not there in Tibet. I'm someone who is born in India, educated here, but I went to Tibet. I was one of the rare cases where I had not only gone to Tibet, I was jailed in Lhasa many years ago, but I was able to see the situation at the ground level, and also in prison. I met political prisoners inside jail in Lhasa. So therefore, I'm speaking from that background, from that experience, and also being a Tibet watcher every day. I am saying that there is absolutely no sense of freedom, either if it's freedom of speech or language or culture. Tibetans are completely made into what is called the secondary subject in overall China, and also particularly in Tibet. So you see, religion and culture are the ones they are attacking. And because of all these reasons, there is a serious situation of human rights violations happening. And looking at the number of Tibetans who had died in 70 years, we have lost one sixth of Tibetan population, which is over more than 1 million Tibetans have lost their life. They are dead. Uh, it's a history, and it is now a memory in the Tibetans. So you see, this genocide that has taken one sixth of Tibetan population and constantly attacks Tibetan religion, culture, and language is the case of genocide that I'm talking about. And therefore it has led to series of self-immolations, because this seems to be the only way of self protest that are left in that are going on inside Tibet. And all these cases that I'm talking about Tibet today is same happening in China's other occupied countries like East Turkestan, which China says is Xinjiang. It is the country of Uyghur Muslim people. They are also facing the same case of genocide. It's happening in Inner Mongolia, what the Mongolians outside the exiles say Southern Mongolia. Southern Mongolia is 18 lakh square kilometer of land, or 1.8, sorry, it's 1.2 million square kilometer of land. In East Turkestan is 1.8 million square kilometer of land. And all these three occupied countries put together make 60% of China's landmass. So from these 60% of China's landmass, China is mining and making cheap made in China products. Now, my final point is, because of this massive mining and genocide in those cases, China is hoping to completely decimate the people, religion, and culture, or homogenize, make them look like, make them one of the Chinese populations, and therefore continue to take advantage of the natural resources from these countries and make cheap made in China products. Now, what is the West and rest of the world doing? All these countries who have been witnessing all this genocide happening in these China's occupied countries have been unashamedly, blatantly trading with China, taking advantage of a dying or a country under genocide. And that includes countries like United States and European countries, and much of the Asian countries, African countries are trading with China, taking advantage of the dictatorship there. So this is a serious case of human rights violations and a case of genocide. And Tibetan voices have not been heard. They are not being attended because all these other countries who've been trading with China, they think that it is their benefit, it is their profiteering from genocide and human rights violations in these countries. So this is all that I have to say for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tenzin Sundula. The way you have explained, given the Tibetan perspective and how, what are those elements which join, whether it is culture, language, religion, which have kept the resistance movement alive, and the way, in spite of all the controls, you explained that how the Tibetans have dared to stand in front of bulldozers of Chinese, or so many people uh, taking to self-immolation. That itself shows that the resistance is alive. But one point which you made, and I hope we all agree with, that it's not something for the rest of world to feel proud about what it is doing, the way it is trying to benefit from the exploitation of Tibetans, of the Uyghurs, of the Mongols by China, so that the companies in the West and other countries can benefit out of it. I think that is another aspect of human rights, for which the responsibility lies on, not on China, but on the rest of world. And rest of world, I think, must wake up to this responsibility. Thank you very much. We have had two perspectives so far. One of a expert, Mr. Jaydev Ranade, who understands China from within, who understands their system, and then Tenzin Suddu, a Tibetan, who gave us a Tibetan perspective. Now we are coming to another very enlightened speaker, Meenakshi Ganguly, who is a former journalist and for last many years now, a very keen watcher of China as the head of Human Rights Watch in South Asia. So, Minakshi, welcome. We are keen to listen to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Sundu and Mr. Ranade. I learn every day, but yet when I hear you speak, it just breaks my heart because we just can't seem to have overcome these challenges. China's human rights record, both at home and abroad, has been causing increasing concern. Human Rights Watch works in over 100 countries, and we've often found China having a negative influence, including on international efforts to ensure justice and accountability in other places. At home, in recent years, Chinese authorities have also sought even more systematically to eradicate, as you've heard, Tibetan cultural, linguistic, and religious freedoms. It has also tried to erase Hong Kong people's human rights and right to free speech. The abuses against the Turkic Muslim population in Xinjiang has also been very well documented. Across the country, the authorities have also silenced and imprisoned human rights defenders, driven them to exile. The authorities have deployed high-tech surveillance tools to detect and deter any kind of speech that might that they might decide is critical of the government or of the Chinese Communist Party. We've of course recently heard of the tennis player who had spoken out about sexual abuse, and the attempts to silence her. But as the world lurches from crisis to crisis, the decades of unresolved rights of Tibetans has dropped from the headlines. And meanwhile, back home, there's been a long, insidious attempt to erase Tibetan identity. This includes arbitrary arrests and torture in custody, secret and unfair trials, or for extraordinarily harsh sentences for peaceful protests, for refusing to denounce the Dalai Lama. And you've already heard about the practice of leading that is leading to the gradual replacement of Tibetans by Chinese as the medium of instruction. Um, I remember going to Dharamsala and meeting hundreds of children because Tibetan families would send their children for education to India. They would make this difficult journey so that they could remain connected with Tibetan identity, with Tibetan language. But over the last decade, we've also seen that there's been increasing border controls. This is the one place where the Chinese authorities knew that there could be problems, as you know, and as Sundu has so efficiently pointed out, the diaspora community has been extremely vocal and continues to be so. Generation after generation of TYC people have spoken up, as have other young Tibetans, and they've all become human rights activists and spoken about the human rights situation in Tibet. And so, in an effort to silence that, perhaps to shut that down, we found that there are increasing border controls so that people are not being able to cross into Nepal anymore and then make the journey to the schools in India. You've heard about the Chinese making, offering the Chinese Constitution, of course, promises freedom of religious belief. China is part of several international human rights treaties that endorse the right to freedom of religion and belief. And yet, we, of course, have heard of the numerous restrictions that make a mockery of these claims. In fact, most Tibetans living in Tibet have learned that they have to avoid openly making politically sensitive remarks. However, it now turns out that even routine communications with people in other countries, by phone or by text, eh, things that are not forbidden under Chinese law, can now lead to arrests and to really harsh sentences. And this again is because, however much the online voices are controlled in China, this is a digital world. It is a connected world. It is hard to hide the crimes that are continuing to occur in Tibet and elsewhere by the Chinese authorities. Last year, the Human Rights Watch produced a report on the trial of four monks in a rural location in Tendro. They had no previous history of protest or activism, and yet they were sentenced to really harsh uh, sentences for things like possessing a picture of the Dalai Lama or for exchanging messages with Tibetans overseas. These increasingly, these severe sentences, these have reflect an increasing pressure on Chinese bureaucrats. It's something that Sundu mentioned, that somehow they have not, after these many decades of oppression, they have not really been able to completely force the Tibetan people into submission. And therefore, there is now these officials are forever looking for new reasons to sort of to allege subversion, to try and create new reasons to address to commit more abuses against Tibetans in Tibet. Uh, there is also this major new emphasis on what they call preventive control, particularly in minority areas. And that means sometimes, often, just trying to identify a potential culprit, and even before they carry out anything that they might be considered a criminal action, and then detaining them. Of course, this has been most recently been demonstrated in the Xinjiang province, where there have been such mass detentions. Um, Today, we are meeting around the anniversary of the June 4, 1989, Tiananmen Square massacre, where military opened fire on countless peaceful protesters and bystanders. Following the killings, the government carried out a national crackdown, arrested thousands of people for so-called counter-revolution. The government has never accepted the responsibility for the massacre or held any officials responsible. Beijing has, of course, recently also put an end to the commemoration of this massacre in Hong Kong, the only one place where it was permitted earlier. Since President Xi Jinping has assumed power in 2013, Chinese delegations at the United Nations have tried to rewrite norms and manipulate existing procedures to minimize scrutiny of Chinese government contact and to weaken accountability mechanisms. We've heard earlier about why there is not enough international pressure. And part of that is China's increasing clout in the international forum. The government has sought to revoke human rights mandates from UN peacekeeping operations, has blocked actions to advance accountability for rights violations, including in Syria, Yemen, Myanmar, Ethiopia, and more recently in Ukraine. China is not just engaged in whitewashing its own human rights violations, but even wants to back others that depends on China's checkbook diplomacy. It is hardly a surprise, therefore, that many Tibetan groups are disappointed, as Mr. Ranade mentioned, after the visit of the UN Human Rights Commissioner. The international community, including the UN, needs to do much more to hold a powerful China accountable for crimes against humanity and other violations. And China itself needs to start reversing course to promote rights both home and abroad. Crushing Tibetan rights, as it has done for decades, not only sets a poor precedent, but leaves people distrusting China's commitment to human rights, to international justice. And as Chinese investments spread, as China spreads, there is going to be much more attention to how China responds to international law and procedures. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Meenakshi. You gave another perspective of how the international community should look at China and how the rest of the world has failed in doing so, especially the UN organizations, which are otherwise responsible for ensuring that there is rule of law and there is protection to human rights. And unfortunately, all those organizations or sections of United Nations, even they have become, if we can use the term, dysfunctional. And thank you very much for giving this perspective. Now, I think this is time we should go to pick up some question answers from our audience. We have with us our colleague, Professor Ayushi Ketkar, who is with JNU. May I ask, you are there, Ayushi?
Yes, yes, sir, very much.
So let's have a few questions for our experts.
Thank you so much. Let me begin with one question each for all the three speakers, the three panelists. Jaydev sir, you very rightly mentioned, and this is a very big concern, the sabotaging of the Free Tibet movement from within. Because here you have an entire generation of Tibetans who are Tibet by birth, Tibetans by birth, but Chinese by upbringing. So where do you see this kind of a thing? Because either in the name of some kind of perks or incentives, uh, Tib- Tibetans by birth, they are espousing the cause of China. So how do you see this panning out in that entire Free Tibet movement? How do you see this? Do you see an entire narrative being changed, or a wrong narrative coming in the fore? I would like your views on that. Tenzin La, it's always a pleasure hearing you, and we wish you a very long stint in not only activism, but hopefully you will see that Free Tibet in your lifetime. You have mentioned about the homogenization project. Two important things that you've mentioned. One is the homogenization project, and the second very important aspect is how the resources of the land are being exploited at a very fast pace, because these kind of things can be a big detriment in the long run, and China is very good at doing that. So do you see this having no control over your resources later on, at a later point of time, even if you are successful in becoming free, you shouldn't be a land bereft of resources, and economically then dependent on China? So I would like your views on that. And Meenakshi ma'am, very important concern, not only for Tibetans, but for any rule abiding nation. Because here you have China, who sits on many rule making bodies, in fact, plays a very key role, has been funding it, has been holding positions, very key positions there, and breaking all rules blatantly, absolutely blatantly. So, in such a scenario, what then can be the checks and balance? Thank you. Let's begin with that. Over to you, Rana Reza.
Okay, thank you, Ayushi, for raising those points. Let me start off by saying that I don't hold a very bleak view of what's going to happen, because while the Chinese have been uh, coercing, compelling the Tibetans over the years, and they have now shifted to, shall I say, a more intense form of doing so, the resistance has continued. And the Tibetans have been trying to find various ways of circumventing Chinese controls. As I said, there is a lot of pressure on the people, the campaign actually against the double-faced carders, etc. The fact of the campaign means that there are enough people who still have, if I may use a very oft-quoted colloquialism, the heart in the right place. So I think that resistance will continue, and I can't help, if you allow me a few seconds, to recall something that was written by a Christian missionary who was in Tibet. He was in Tibet for about 5+ years. He was a doctor. He was an American. And he wrote this autobiography. A person called Sheldon, I forget the first name. And he said he was there. He said, as a doctor, I thought I would be able to minister to the needs of the people in this inhospitable land. And he was there, mind you, in 1911, 1912. There was disease, there was all kinds of. And as a doctor, he thought he could cure them. He had the medicines, and yet he said, by the time I left, I found I had there were only 3.5 Christians. And then he explained. He said one was me, the other was my wife, the third was my daughter, and the half, he said, was a Khampa who was a friend of the whole Lord. And whenever I met him and I said, "Are you a convert?" he used to laugh and say, "Yes, if you want me to be." So he said that is the half. But for him to say that after so many years he was not able to convert anyone, living in high mountains, inhospitable terrain, without the comforts, speaks to a resilience the Tibetans have and which their religion has given them. I think flowing from that, the reverence that we see that the Tibetans have for the Dalai Lama and for the institution of the Dalai Lama is, I think, what will keep them going. And let me just conclude on one note, as an Indian, and shall I say, a person who belongs to the home of Buddhism also. that, nothing is inexorable. I mean, a rise does not mean it's going to be perpetual. There's going to be a fall too. It's going to come down too. And when that happens, I think Tibet will rise. I'll end on that. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Yes, Tenzilla.
You're muted. Tenzin, you're muted.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, before I answer the question set to me, I'd like to comment a little bit about the previous question that was asked to Jaydev Ranadeji as a Tibetan, and also being in a freedom movement. The experience is a little unique, and therefore I'd like to comment. In any freedom movement, whether it was the Indian freedom movement or the freedom movement in Europe during the Nazi regime, or in any of the cases, there's always this 10% of the population who are willing to give their life and fight and die. But there is also the 5% of the population who are taking advantage of the dictatorial regime and who would be absolutely corrupted and try to be side with whosoever has the power. And the large majority, which is actually 80 to 85%, who are always muted, silent, not willing to show any sign. But the moment there is the sign for hope or for freedom, they would lead and turn the wave. And that's how it happened with the Indian freedom struggle. You see, even in our case, I've seen the same situation. When I was in Tibet many years ago, I'd seen Tibetans working for China. But at the same time, these are the people who are taking advantage of the situation. But in the core of their mind, they are always the Tibetan in the inside. Yeah. So this is what I just wanted to comment as a Tibetan, and therefore they being in the freedom movement. Now, you asked me two questions. One is about the homogenization. Second was about the resources. Now, the reason why technically in running an occupied country, the technical reason why China is trying to homogenize is because the Chinese government at the moment today are not only ruling over 60% of its landmass as occupied country, but the majority of the population are within China. So they are and they have been trying to create one kind of public mentality and orientation that everybody thinks alike. They all have what is called the nationalism. It's not really nationalism, it's just obedience to the state. And this is what they're trying to do in occupied countries like Tibet or East Turkestan, Southern Mongolia, and Manchuria, so that the ruling is easier and more effective. So it is creating obedience, not nationalism, and therefore unique Tibetan culture, language, especially the Khampo warrior spirit that Jaydev Ranadeji talked about. These are aberrations. These are huge problems for the Chinese government. They cannot even understand how to talk to them, how to advise them, or how to control them. They have no idea how to deal with these kind of Tibetans who they consider are barbarians. So this is the situation about homogenization, and I think that this is completely a failure on part of China trying to rein in. So China was trying to firstly trying to threaten them, trying to kill them. When it didn't work, they thought they could lure them by promising wealth and benefits. That also did not work. Now they are trying to appropriate them by saying we all are one people in one country, and their religion and culture are exoticized at one point, but at the same time systematically trying to destroy it from the inside. Again, that's a failure. um, about the second question you asked me about mining and fear of being bereft of resources, I think China neither has the technology nor do they actually have the capacity to completely empty 25 lakh square kilometer of land of resources. um, I'm not definitely underestimating China's voracious need for natural resources to feed the industries. But you see, China tried to build railway lines into Tibet in 1949, and they were able to do that only in 2006, and that too with Canadian technology, bombardier railways. So you see, one, there is the corruption within China. Two, um, they try to take advantage of this. Now the fear is that China today is mining Tibet with use of Western technology, and many of the Western companies, Western governments are complicit in taking advantage of the Chinese dictatorship and occupation of Tibet. And therefore, when I travel to the West, I very often tell them in their face, I have not come here to beg for support. I have come here to make you accountable to the duty you owe to the Tibetan people, because you have taken advantage of the dictatorship and you have worked with the Chinese government in suppressing Tibetans. And if Tibetans have suffered, and today the self-immolations has come to 157, it's because of you and your government who has taken advantage of this. And you should be not only ashamed, but take responsibility and therefore come out. And now that China is an enemy and a threat to United States and to the NATO and Quad countries, it is time now for all these governments to now stand up for the Tibetan people and against the Chinese corrupt communist government.
Thank you, Sundu. That well said. And I suppose, Ayushi, in terms of my response to your question, some of it is what Sundu has alluded to. There is the investment, there are the trade opportunities, there are strategic goals, all of these things that seem to drive international concern. I do want to flag a couple of things. One is what China may have exported. We are finding increasing a rise in a sort of populist authoritarianism around the world. And almost all of these governments tend to be about as prickly as China to criticism, but have also taken a leaf out of China's book in beating the drum about, oh, this is an internal matter, we do not want Western values being promoted, and so on. And to that, there is a counter. The counter is that while the Universal Declaration on Human Rights may have come after the Second World War and the horror of the Holocaust, the principles of human rights, the dignity of life, the dignity of liberty, is enshrined in almost all of these societies from long before that. And therefore, when people, it's only for a bit that they can keep promoting this idea that, oh, well, these are all Western imports and these are, sort of motivated answers. They are not. Human values are human values and often are rooted in their faiths. And those eventually start coming forward. And while we see the crushing of what happened in Hong Kong, we also have to realize that Hong Kong happened. And therefore, people at some point or the other begin to resist. So that is one side of it, which is just the sort of, the pressures of public opinion versus, what can be an authoritarian answer to that response. The second is also what Sudu responded to, alluded to, which is the economic ideas. We are seeing now uh, an international effort, and I'm sure Mr. Ranade has more on this. I mean, or Vijay does. I mean, this is that there is an effort to try and understand that economic punishments should not be visited upon the people, but upon states or state interests. So we have seen, for instance, in Myanmar, where military-run industry, military-run companies are the ones that are being targeted. That kind of targeting of targeted sanction, those steps that can be taken to try and contain abuses, is something that the government, that various states and international agencies should look toward. The third and the last thing that I want to say is that we need to stop being apologists. You see, the thing is that because, as I said, we work on 100 countries, no country Not a single of one of those 100 countries that we work on has a perfect human rights record. I mean, we can, and of course, there is always the question of Bangladesh saying, well, Europe, you treat refugees so badly, stop lecturing me about the Rohingya. And that is a wrong approach to take. The justification of another bad behavior should not be how you do conduct your business, because in the end you are accountable to your people and to the community. And so therefore this public endeavor towards greater good needs to become more normalized. We seem to have lost that in our sort of race to wealth and aspirations. But we need to bring that back, because that will be China's counter. China, what does China sell? China tells me that I can buy a blanket for 100 rupees and it will wither away day after tomorrow. But at this moment, I have a shiny thing that has come really cheap to me. So that investment into the long-term razais that our grandmothers used to have is what we need to go back to. We need to understand the short-term consumption and gratification versus the long-term commitment, and it's much harder work, to a better future for all of us. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, I think this is time now. Thank you very much for all this question and answer session, Ayushi. Now, I think it's time to go to Mr. Gompo Dhundu, the president of Tibetan Youth Congress, who is also a co-host. I would request him for his concluding remarks and, of course, vote of thanks. Gompo Dhundu, please.
Thank you. Tashidle and greetings to all. So before I extend my Thanksgiving remarks from the two of our organization, I would like to give a very little short remarks on today's topic, though today's topic is well covered and highlighted by all the three eminent speakers. So since the Chinese illegal occupation of Tibet in 1950, they have killed millions of Tibetan people. They destroyed thousands of Tibetan monasteries. Even the Tibetan human rights situation inside Tibet is worsening day by day. But the Tibetan issue is not just a human right issue. So our ultimate goal is to restore a complete independence, which ultimately for the well-being of Tibetan people, and which ultimately being a peace to this whole world. So now the China have introduced a lot of new policy in Tibet since from 1959. They have, with their hardline policy, crushed the Tibetan voice against their repressive policy. Since from 1960, they introduced a cultural revolution, and their very motive is to change the Tibetan into the Chinese, but they are not successful in their own policy or the mission to convert Tibetan into a Chinese. In 1980s and 90s, they introduced a patriotic re-education. So they tried to change the mindset of second generation of Tibetan people, but still they are not success in their mission. That was proved during 2008 mass movement all across the three traditional region of Tibet. Since 2009, from 2009 till date, more than 157 Tibetan people have made a supreme sacrifice of self-immolating for the just cause of Tibet, which show the Tibetan people resistance or the Tibetan people determination to raise the vice against the Chinese Communist Party. Moreover, Tibetan people resistance movement to restore ultimate goal of independent Tibet. So these days, the Chinese government is also introducing lots of new policy, especially the Sinicization of a Tibetan culture, Tibetan Buddhism, and Tibetan education. Now, recently we got an information from Tibetan Inside Tibet that now with the new education policy, they have forced the Tibetan in a preschool to attend the boarding school, and they are giving the Chinese-oriented education. The Tibetan school, which is run and operated by the non-government organization or monastery, were forced to shut. And this is a very serious issue. Tibetan activists across the globe, we are very much concerned, and we are trying to do all the lobby and to pressurize the Chinese Communist government to amend this new rule. Moreover, we want to urge and ask all the Tibetans sitting in the diaspora to preserve our own Tibetan culture, identity, and language in the free world to counter the Chinese repressive policy. Since from 2019, there is a lots of illegal detention of Tibetan writers, scholars, and intellectuals who spoke, who write, who raised against the Chinese repressive policy. Like Go Sherab Gyatso was detained for 10 years into a Chinese prison for raising his voice against the Chinese Communist Party. Meanwhile, the Rebgong Gendun Hundup was also detained for writing a statement against the Chinese repressive policy. In a very recent case, Alhamu from Jirusong, she was a mother of three, was detained to kill in a Chinese detention. The crime that she committed was keeping a portrait of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and contacting her own relatives in overseas. So this is the kind of the dire and the critical situation inside Tibet. But the Tibetan resistance movement will be continuously carried not only from outside the overseas world, but from inside also. Our Tibetan brothers and sisters are equally determined, strong enough to counter the Chinese repressive policy. So the Tibetan Youth Congress, as one of the largest activism and the movement-based organization, will always carry all the non-violent strategic goal to make China accountable for all the death and destruction that is carried out inside Tibet. And moreover, we always say that we all the Tibetan are born to be an activists. So we will continue to raise the voice of innocent, voiceless Tibetan people who are still suffering under the brutal Chinese rule. So with this, firstly, I would like to thank Jaydev Ranerjee for accepting our invitation, and we are very much thankful for your help, and we are very much grateful for your knowledgeful sharing your knowledgeful inside information not only on the Tibet but the Chinese, all the Chinese strategic their policies and all. So Jaydev Ranerjee, I'm very much thankful on behalf of both organizations. Thank you for accepting our invitation and be with us. And secondly, I want to thank Tinsu Tsundrila, a well-known Tibetan writer and activist, and a very proud member of Tibetan Youth Congress. And thank you for your vocal and thank you for your active involvement in Tibetan activism work. And thanks for accepting our invitation to be part of this important panel discussion. Now, I also would like to thank Meenakshi Ganguly for taking your time and be part of this important panel discussion. As your organization, Human Rights Watch report, are very much helpful for our Tibetan activists and organization like us. So whenever we have a lobby work or a testimony on the Tibetan, the critical situation, your reports are very much helpful for us. And I'm very much thankful for your participation in this event. And I also would like to thank our co-host and our moderator of the event, Vijay Krantiji, a longtime friend and especially a very dear and care supporter of Tibetan Youth Congress. So, sir, thank you very much for your expert way. Thank you for being the bulldozer of all this event. Now, we are having a very successful joint campaign, joint this virtual panel discussion, co-organized by two of our organization. So, sir, thank you very much for this program. And I want to thank our Professor Ayushi Ketkar for your expertly handling and this Q&A session. So thank you very much for your time, for your efforts, and thank you very much. And for last but not least, I want to thank Lusan Sidinla from Tibet Action Institute for helping us in all this technical work. So I'm very much thankful for all the people involved in this important online virtual discussion. So I also would like to thank a number of online participants who joined this important program virtually. So this program is very helpful. Those who are joining virtual online can visit this on the live program. Many of them are visiting after this program. So this program will be kept in a TYC Facebook and YouTube page, and also in Vijay Grandhiji Facebook and YouTube page. So thank you very much, Rashidullah and Pyogyalo. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everybody, and let us conclude today's webinar with one common observation that no doubt there is a very strong suppression by the Chinese, and they have evolved or used all their technologies and power and resources to crush the resistance of Tibetan people. But it also sends the message that despite 70 years of such a control, the resistance in the Tibetan hearts and Tibetan minds is still alive. So, whatever be the dimensions of human rights denial in Tibet by China, it is also an assurance to all those freedom loving people across the world that the people of Tibet have not given up. So, thank you very much, everybody, and let's meet very soon for a new with a new subject. So, thank you very much.